So, this morning's session is on, the first series is on biological and artificial mechanisms, and our first talk is entitled Learning Locally and Globally, and our speaker from Google is Blaise Agüera y Arcas. Welcome, Blaise.
Thank you so much, David.
Thanks. Sure.
And thank you all for coming so early to see my talk. I really appreciate it. So I have a group that works on AI at Google in Seattle and in 9 other places around the world. And the things that we mostly focus on involve AI or machine learning on devices as opposed to in the data center. And I'll talk a little bit about why it is that we're so interested in doing AI on devices instead of in the data center in a moment. But this also has led us down the path of thinking a lot about machine creativity and about networks that not only analyze stimuli and generate semantics or meaning from that, but that do the opposite as well. That start with stimulus and then generate, or rather start with semantics and then generate stimulus. I'm sorry, Third Rail Coffee wasn't open yet. We also do some work on computational neuroscience, and we have quite a bit of contact with computational neuroscientists, and we also do a lot of thinking about AI ethics and about the impacts of AI on society and the impacts of society on AI, and the way those things are in a sort of interesting and strange loop at the moment. Obviously, it behooves all of the big tech companies to be thinking hard about this, because we are now in these positions of being a part of some kind of a nervous system for the entire planet, or for most of the planet, and that carries with it certain responsibilities and a need to really think globally about what it is that we're doing. So yeah, local and global learning in the title doesn't refer to local and global optimization or anything like that. I'll be talking about other and slightly more metaphorical uses of those words. So I want to talk today a little bit about AI on devices and about a technique called federated learning, which we have started to publish on in the past year, but which many of you may not have heard of, and I think it's very interesting and maybe important. And some of the machine learning fairness considerations that arise in the context of federated learning, or that federated learning can address, and some of the ethical considerations as well. So first of all, point of definition. Nobody knows what AI means or is, but as I'm going to use it in this talk, I just mean modern neural nets. So there's nothing radically different about the neural nets that we're using today than the ones that Frank Rosenblatt was using in the 1960s. But of course, we're able to do much bigger ones and much more structurally non-trivial ones nowadays. They are loosely cortically inspired. Adrienne and I get into arguments, sometimes about, whether that biological inspiration is something that should be taken seriously or not. One way or the other. Of course, the perceptron was very much biologically inspired, and these modern networks do have more properties in common with biological computation than a lot of the machine learning that was sort of more in vogue in the 80s, 90s, and certainly a lot more in common with the way brains work than what used to pass for AI in the 80s and 90s, kind of rule-based expert systems and things like this. The main property of these nets, of course, is that they don't have any feature engineering, and that's really key. Meaning that there isn't a bunch of hard code at the front end of the network that is doing dimensionality reduction before things are fed into the network. We rely on the network to do dimensionality reduction, as well as whatever sort of analysis happens afterward. So this encompasses all sorts of architectures, whether they're convolutional or recurrent or skip connections, whether they have memories, long short-term memories, other kinds of things, attentional models, multimodal, supervised, unsupervised, semi-supervised, so all sorts of things about how they're built and what functions they're optimizing and how they're wired up are, all of that is sort of open. But this is what I mean by AI, this stuff. I don't think it's necessarily interesting to talk about whether it's new or not. Certainly, we're able to do things with it now that we have not been able to do, and this is a field in very rapid development. So this is Jeff Dean, who began the Google Brain Group at right around the time, or just before the time that I joined Google 4 years ago. So he and I are colleagues, and Jeff is sort of a legend at Google for a variety of reasons. He's played a key role in building a lot of the infrastructure that Google runs on, and he had the foresight to understand that the infrastructure for deep networks was going to be a really important thing, and that was the main reason that Brain started. And the reasons that this was clearly going to be important for Google were twofold. One is that deep networks, at least as we train them today, are very data intensive to train. So they require tons and tons of training data, and Google is one of a very small handful of companies that have massive amounts of training data. So obviously, that's going to be interesting. And the other thing is that they required and still require very large amounts of computation. And Google also has gigantic data centers. So these two things are kind of the obvious reasons why this was an important thing for Google to invest in. The big data and the big computation, and indeed, beyond just having lots of undifferentiated cores of sort of Turing von Neumann type processors in the giant data centers, we have started to deploy these specialized TensorFlow processing units. This is a rack of TPUs that can do ungodly numbers of neural net computations per second, both training and inference. And this is a pretty good use of really big computation in the data center, and this is now starting to be made available via Google Cloud to researchers and other companies and so on. So why the hell would we think about on device given all of that? It seems like devices are this sort of very small thing compared to all of this incredible computational power that's available in the data center, and moreover, devices don't have all of the giant data that's available in the data center. So it's not necessarily obvious, to a lot of people why this should be of such interest to us, not only period, but to Google in particular. And my answers are because we can and because we have to, because we must. And I'd like to explain a little bit about why those things are true, and how the scaling works to make that necessary. So with respect to we can, this is some evidence that we can. This is an Android phone running a convolutional net that recognizes species of birds in real time on the device, and this demo is a couple of years old now. So this is not even necessarily state of the art, but certainly it can be done. So this is again a phone with no special neural net processor or whatever, just running on the normal ARM CPU, and it's able to do a pretty hard task with a fairly sophisticated convolutional net. It's running on the ARM. It works. It does burn a lot of power. If you have this thing running and you keep it running for 10 minutes, your battery is going to drain. So there's a little bit of a practical problem. The things that make it work are a combination of model shrinking. So this is a lot of sort of fiddly applied research, some of which is theoretically motivated, and some of which is frankly just hacking. that involves taking much bigger networks that work and then asking the question, how can these be reduced? You know, how can we take out layers or connect them differently, or think about different sorts of trade-offs with respect to width and depth, or shrink the number of bits in each weight, or do other tricks, reuse, make the filters separable, things like this, in order to reduce the size of the model and to decrease the number of operations that it takes to carry out the model from beginning to end. So MobileNet was sort of a canonical convolutional net architecture that we published a couple of years ago that takes all kinds of convolutional networks and provides a sort of recipe for shrinking them without losing much precision or accuracy. And so that's nice. But I think the real promise with respect to model shrinking comes from approaches like AutoML, which are basically saying, well, why don't we take an optimization approach to designing the network in the first place? If one thinks about optimization over the space of possible network architectures, network topologies, that's a really nice sort of meta optimization problem, and by the way, a pretty good use for these gigantic TensorFlow processing unit racks. I mean, if you think about single evaluations of a network as being, or single evaluations of the function you're optimizing as train an entire network, right? And that's the primitive, and you're doing that many times. You can imagine that's a rather computationally intensive task, and that's definitely one of the things that I think is good to use that massive computation for doing, in other words, the design of neural networks as opposed to just the training of neural networks. Now, current generations of AutoML, this is still a project I think that is sort of in its infancy, and the current approaches really are just geared toward things like minimize the number of adds and multiplies while maximizing or while also keeping the loss minimized. But one can do more sophisticated things. One can actually model how a real device performs the computation and require that it minimize the number of joules of energy that are used for doing the computation, or do that under some latency constraint, and do that with a more or less sophisticated model of how these things actually run in real life. Because it turns out that the adds and multiplies are really only a very small part of the story. When you really get down to sort of hacking the way these things run on processors, you realize that how the cache lines are filled, and whether the instructions can be parallelized the right way, and whether the data flow is properly laminar, and whether the whole next set of weights can be loaded into cache at the same time, and all of these kinds of things really matter. So it's not just a single sort of proxy number like adds and multiplies. It really is how well does it run. So that's a lot of rather fussy engineering that I hope we can outsource to large-scale optimization and not have to rely on engineers' intuitions for too much longer. Although in the meantime, the engineers are certainly still keeping the optimization on its toes. I mean, we have a sort of Stagger Lee competition happening at the moment. One of the original authors of MobileNet, Mark Sandler, was sort of annoyed that that AutoML had beat MobileNet, and at least in numbers of adds and multiplies, and so when he really tested it, he found that the original AutoML solution, even though it had fewer adds and multiplies, didn't actually run faster because of some of the things I've just talked about. But he nonetheless set out to beat it again, and there's a MobileNet 2 paper that was published recently that that again sort of ups the ante. This is obviously not a game that can be won by humans, but I'm rooting for Mark to go as fast as he can and keep the machine on its toes. But anyway. Here, this is a plot. There are many versions of plots like this on the web that shows not only Moore's law, which is the famous sort of doubling of numbers of transistors on chips since the development of semiconductors, way back in the mid 20th century. Well, this one only goes to 1970. In theory, one can bring it a little further back, but it also shows a few other curves that that have various other kinds of names, like Kumi's law and Dennard scaling and so on. And it shows a more interesting story than just this sort of Moore's law that many of us have heard about and grew up with. So number of transistors on a chip has continued to rise exponentially and continues to do so today. But the frequency at which chips are running has stopped growing sometime around 2006. And for those of you, who are old enough to still remember, like the Intel 386 or 486 or the Pentium or whatever, will remember, that the number of gigahertz used to be this thing, that was sold as part of the specs of a computer, and at some point that stopped being on the box. People stopped talking about the gigahertz because it had stopped going up. The number of transistors kept going up, but the gigahertz stopped going up, and along with it, and then there's some very fundamental sort of physical reasons why that is so. So the scaling laws no longer allowed the frequency to keep on rising, and the voltage to keep on falling. And that kind of broke the backbone of Moore's law in a fairly fundamental way. And you can see that via the blue curve, spec-int single-thread performance. That is a sort of proxy of how fast a classical sort of program can run on a single core of the processor. It stopped growing more or less. There's still some gains after the frequency stops because of all kinds of increasingly baroque and sophisticated optimizations on chips that do things like speculative execution and out-of-order execution and all kinds of crazy stuff. At this point, the actual part of the chip that does the work is very small compared with the part of the chip that does all of these crazy kind of calisthenics to attempt to kind of reorder the instructions and do things that might eke out a little bit more performance. But that's what's led to that droop. And you can see that around that same time, the number of cores on a chip began to grow. Right? So nobody was interested in growing the number of cores on the chip until the scaling law that said that the speed with which a single core could execute code stopped growing. And so then the game became, well, can we figure out some way that putting more computers in the computer will help? And it does help a little bit because, at the time, graphical interfaces were becoming a big thing, and windowing systems, and they already become a big thing. I'm dating myself now, but there are multiple windows going on. There are multiple processes. You can always try and farm out those different processes and those different apps to different cores, but that's not a game that scales either, right? It's not like you're not running 1,000 apps at once. You're not running 1 million apps at once. We're not going to keep on increasing the number of cores and somehow make that pay dividends in a serial computing world. Well, interestingly, 2006, which is when the number of cores starts going up and when spec-int starts to droop, was also the year that Joshua and the deep learning people started to take over NIPS. And I think this is in retrospect not a coincidence, or maybe it's just luck, but it turns out that the neural net architectures are inherently massively parallel. Of course, right? We if you were to put our brain on one of these curves, I think it's not really legit to compare the number of neurons to the number of transistors or something, but you could try and make some kind of equivalence. A normal, a pyramidal neuron. How many transistors would it take to simulate one, and multiply, and we'd be way up in quote unquote number of transistors. Our megahertz would be, I don't know, maybe kilohertz. Right? We have sort of millisecond accuracy in spike timing. But we make up for that by having a ton of processing units all going at the same time and all working in parallel. And that's interesting because it means that there is this other computational paradigm that can do all kinds of tasks that are orthogonal to the kinds of tasks that we think about computers today doing, about sort of word processing or playing video games or whatever. That can make use of those massive numbers of transistors, even as the frequency goes down. My expectation is that that's exactly the future of the chips that are in all of our personal devices. This is actually one that we are using today in a little camera that we just shipped on shelves a couple of weeks ago, called the Clips camera. And this Movidius chip costs about what a cappuccino costs. I wish I'd managed to score one of those before the beginning of the talk. And if you look at the layout of the chip, it has these two little tiny Spark cores on it, which are the classical computer. So it has a two-core classical computer, and the entire rest of the chip area is devoted to parallel computation, which is useful for running neural nets. And that's in fact exactly what this thing is doing. And by the way, in the future, I fully expect that as the clock rate goes down, these things can stack up in 3 dimensions, and eventually the classical core will be minuscule compared with the number of transistors on the device. The vast majority of the transistors on the device will be running neural nets. I fully expect that to be the case in 5-6 years. Now, I think that we have to be running these neural nets on devices as well. I should have said a couple of other things as well. Successors of this chip that are in production today can run 4 trillion operations per second in this parallel mode, which is a lot. So why is it important for us to be running these neural nets on devices? Well, there was a little feature that our group shipped in Android back in the fall called Now Playing, and the way it works is on the lock screen of your phone, if you're playing music, you see what music is playing, right? If it's coming from inside the phone, and we thought it'd be nice if the lock screen also showed if there's music playing and what the music is if it's coming from outside the phone. It's useful. Apple just bought Shazam for $400 million, so it must be useful to somebody. But of course, if you think about the idea of this being done in the data center, that's unacceptable, right? That would imply that every phone has an open microphone, is listening to its environment, and is streaming everything that it hears to the data center all the time, for the data center to then wake up and say, that sounds like music, and here's a match, and send the result down. And that would, of course, be a kind of surveillance that not only violates wiretapping laws in the US and in many other parts of the world, but also creates a sort of civil liberties nightmare in which observation of the data center by somebody with the privilege to do that, which would include certain governments and agencies and so on, would amount to being able to hear anywhere that somebody has one of these devices. And that's obviously a really troubling idea. So that can change, that can look different if instead the ability to do this task is something that is inherent to the device itself, right? If it knows how to recognize music, as opposed to it being Google that recognizes the music. Now, you can't sort of do everything that Google can do on the device. Google knows tens of millions of songs. There's all of YouTube to index, and all of Google Play, and so on. And one can't fit that many sort of song fingerprints on the device. But these things have the usual sort of fat head and long tail of many distributions. If you think about, well, suppose that 100,000 can fit on the device. That's not so unreasonable. You certainly shouldn't pick 100,000 at random from the 40 million. If you are intelligent about picking what that cache looks like, it can cover a very, very large fraction of the result, especially if the phone is smart enough to cache in the fingerprints of the music that you will likely care about. So it can do that, and it can also be smart enough, maybe eventually to recognize, that this sounds like Bristol electronic music from the late '90s. I don't know what it is, but swipe here to Google it, right? And then you have a very nice kind of situation in which your phone is smart, and it can ask Google things, and you're in that loop, and there's no surveillance going on. So this is a model for the kind of stuff that we do, And a lot of it has to do with thinking about the intelligence, thinking about the AI as not just being a giant robot in the cloud that is serving everybody, but rather the AI on the device as being like an extension of you. Right, we believe, in this kind of X-Men picture of, ourselves becoming sort of superhuman or getting these little extra cortices. In this case, it was a very modest sort of exocortex that is a sort of music expert that is with you and extends you. So this is another little kind of exocortex project. This is the CLIPS camera that I mentioned earlier, which has the Movidius chip in it, and it's about the size of 2 Triscuits stacked on top of each other. And what it does is it's both a camera and it's a photographer. And the photographer part thinks about that lens as an eye, not as a camera. And so there's a button on it which allows you to take pictures with the camera, but there's also a button inside which allows the AI to take pictures. So it's got lots of different neural nets in it. It recognizes faces and gestures and hugging and jumping and a variety of different kinds of objects and so on and so forth. And basically it's looking for moments that look interesting. The device is targeted mostly at parents of small children who get obsessed suddenly with taking tons and tons of pictures of their kids, much to the kids' annoyance once they get big enough to realize what's up with that. And this essentially lets you just put the thing down and then do stuff with your kid, and then all these little clips are sort of taken for you. So it's a little robotic photographer. This device would be a horror if what we're going on, right, is that this is a sort of streaming camera that is streaming the visual contents of everything that is being seen up to Google's data center for analysis, right? I was actually reading The Circle when I was interviewing at Google 4 years ago, and in fact was up on stage with Dave Eggers, with the author, and Maria Semple around the same time. We were doing kind of like a critique of his book. So I did not want one of the projects that I made at Google to be literally something from The Circle, and in some sense this is the very opposite of that. It's not a surveillance device. It's not internet connected. It is entirely local. And the fact that all of those neural nets run locally means that it's empowering as opposed to disempowering. There's no chilling effect involved. Nothing that happens on this device is being sent to Google or anywhere else. You're in complete control. And all of that is true because you have bought something that has a little brain in it. It is a robot, as opposed to being a surveillance device. So none of this is to say that inference in the cloud is unimportant. It's really important to be able to have a music recognizer that can recognize millions of songs, but having these capabilities that become omnipresent and extend us, are a really important part of that picture as well. And I was very happy to see some of the press coverage of clips, sort of recognize the both how cool that is and how scary it would be if it were being done badly. And all of the more thoughtful press, sort of really went into the details of how this was not actually a problematic device from an ethical point of view. Okay, but how does such a system improve? So one of the real challenges here is that if you think about us training a neural net and deploying it on devices, the fact that when you run something as a service, the use of that service generates training data that then allows one to train a next generation of the neural net to be better. One breaks that model if one thinks about putting neural nets on devices and then not touching the data. So how does this system improve? Well, so consider for a second the way this happens with neural nets nowadays. So stochastic gradient descent with mini batches works by taking all of the training data, all of the supervision sort of labeled training data, and breaking it up into small batches across many cores in the data center. And each of these cores is continually sort of evaluating a gradient. So how should the weights improve relative to that batch, and sending those partial gradients to a parameter server where they're added up. And they're added to the weights, and then the new weights are sent back down to to all of those cores. So it's a distributed problem already to do large-scale training of neural nets, and we we've been working on a technique for several years now that takes that approach and decentralizes it further. So that instead of the distributed gradient descent problem being solved on many cores in the data center, it's being solved on the devices themselves. So the training data never leaves your device, but instead those gradients are computed right there, and then the changes in the weights are what are sent up through the internet to a parameter server and added up. Now, if you're kind of thinking carefully about this, you might wonder, well, could you reconstruct the data that was observed by a device from the partial gradient that was sent up? And this is a really interesting question, which actually relates to something that Josh Tenenbaum and I were talking about yesterday, which is, how can you tell the difference between memorization and generalization? If you take one step using one training sample, then you can imagine reconstructing that sample from those partial gradients. If you have too sparse a data set, and you have a very high capacity neural net, then you can imagine it just memorizing all of the training examples. But if you add many of these together, if you add many steps together, then you get to generalization and no memorization. And so the way we solve it in this case is that all of the devices do lots of gradient steps and then compress and encrypt the weight deltas and send the compressed and encrypted weight deltas up to the cloud, where they're added together in crypto space. And only when many thousands have been added together does the answer come out, and then is able to propagate back down. All right, I have to wrap up, so I'm going to sort of quickly race through. I've sometimes called this the dark matter of big data, because the amount of data that is available for this kind of decentralized training is vastly greater than any amount of data that could ever make its way to the data center, right? If you start thinking about cameras and microphones and screens and so on, right, it's a vast amount of data, but you want all of that to stay private or dark or hidden. And yet there's vastly more of it than one could ever accumulate in the data center at any given time. So that's why we're so excited about this federated learning approach. This is already in nearly 1 billion Android devices. And it's being used now to optimize keyboards and a couple of other local techniques. We hope to scale that up a lot further. And I guess I should end there.
Great.
Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions. Raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. While we're getting the mics out, I think I have maybe a quick question for you. How about the role of neuromorphic analog VLSI as a power-saving future for this kind of mobile AI?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So, Kwabena Boahen at Stanford, has been working for many years on really funky architectures for chips that involve, making them noisy or stochastic and using timing rather than numbers to, more like spike timing to represent things. The IBM True North chip a little while back did similar tricks. What we have been seeing so far is that there's a tremendous amount of headroom to get sort of incredible performance out of while still sticking to classical sort of chip techniques. And some of these more exotic things may yield some results, but a lot of them also break a lot of assumptions that have a huge amount of invested optimization in them. So it's a little bit like the way the internal combustion engine was so highly optimized. There's quite a high bar for the electric car to clear, right? So we still have a lot of headroom before we go to exotic things. Yeah.
So you talked about how the data center can help to improve the neural nets on device. I'm wondering, for example, a human photographer just review their result and using maybe reinforcement learning, from a single, presumably at least. Single user, and how on device without any connection, even on the learning part, that can use reinforcement learning from the user to personalize.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and so the whole federated learning approach actually involves essentially personalization. It involves local learning on the device. So personalization kind of comes automatically. I didn't really get to talk about how one actually uses a combination of federation and personalization, but that's of course the next step, right? How do you do this thing in a way that is personalized? So we've done a variety of experiments of this kind that involve learning embeddings for users as well in a decentralized way, which starts to get starts to get pretty interesting. So yeah, I made a talk that is about twice as long than I should have. We would have talked about that.
Well, then, when the next question is being asked, put your hands up and we can get the mic to you for the following one. Go ahead.
So to a neurobiologist, what you've told us is all biologically consistent, possibly even biologically inspired. Because the science fiction novels of my youth always featured, you know, giant brains the size of a galaxy or something. But what evolution came up with was a bunch of mobile devices, each one of which had a small number of processing units and efficient use, and that's us.
Right.
And when we, you know, our hippocampi are presented each individually with the environments we occupy, and we learn using these common rules individually about things.
Right.
And the way we communicate, of course, with one another is socially.
Right, exactly.
So actually, this is all very nice and very neurobiological.
I agree, and in fact, there were two models. I had two models in mind when we were thinking about this in the beginning. One of them is the way bacteria share genes, right? So they have a kind of gene sharing technology, if you like, right? That's the opposite of a normal evolutionary process. But the other model was actually the way, for example, doctors who have a doctor-patient relationship also get together in conferences and share best practices and improve what they're doing without violating that doctor-patient confidentiality. And that's, I don't know if it's a biological model, but it's certainly a real-world model.
A question over here.
Hi. So at Google, you guys are sort of on the forefront of this synergistic relationship between humans and AI. What do you think are the biggest challenges remaining in trying to promote that relationship?
You mean biggest challenges in terms of relationship between humans and AIs? Boy, that's a long talk in its own right. I think that ML fairness is a huge one, and one that we've actually put a tremendous amount of work into as well. So, how the distributions that are being learned by the neural nets are distributions that we actually believe are fair or ethical, which often are different from the distributions that exist in our own heads. Right? We have all kinds of prejudice and bias, and so in a sense, we're trying to make things that are better than in a very real sense, we're trying to make things that are better than ourselves. And the training data that we have is from us. So that's a major challenge. And I think another major challenge comes from the fact that there is a society of minds already, or a larger network. You don't have to look to federated learning. You can think about Twitter or about how social media work, and there are all kinds of crazy, and unpredictable effects that emerge at the systems level as one applies local rules. Some of which have really problematic consequences for society, and so I think those are huge. Those are huge challenges.
Time for one more. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks so much.